This is discussion 11A, although it's the only part of discussion 11. I want to talk about a concept called Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Islam just means the house of Islam. And in Muslim writings, you'll often hear the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, opposed to the house of strife or the house of conflict or the house of struggle. And and that's the world outside of the Muslim world. And so there's a sort of setting up of this set of opposites: the holy Muslim world, the house of Islam, versus the unholy house of strife; the sacred house of Islam versus the profane house of strife; the moral community of the house of Islam versus the immoral community of the house of strife. And so there's a really strong sense of a sort of an us and them. And if you're safely within the house of Islam, you're in a society that has committed itself to living morally according to Sharia, according to Muslim law, and it is a moral society where everybody is sort of pulling in the right moral direction. And the assumption is if you're living outside of the house of Islam, and lots of Muslims do live outside of the house of Islam, you're living in a society where the basic thrust of society is not in the direction of Muslim morality, that you have to sort of fight against that morality, the morality of society, because it's contrary to Islam. All right. So there's a real sense of this sort of us and them, that you're in safe territory in the house of Islam, and you can live a moral life fairly easily because the society itself is moral and the rules are moral and they're built around Islam. Or you can live outside of the house of Islam, and then you have to really struggle to live a moral life because the society is working against you. In terms of practical boundaries, Dar al-Islam is really any place that you have Sharia law imposed. Now, the assumption is Dar al-Islam also has a majority Muslim population. But for all practical purposes, in the Middle Ages, this meant the Muslim Empire, right? Under the Umayyads, under the Abbasids, that was the House of Islam. But we'll see that over time, Muslims would move outside of the House of Islam, and other places would be added to the House of Islam, and I'll talk about that in a second. For right now, I want to just talk about one other concept, one other idea, which is the idea of jihad. Now, in the West today, we hear people throw around the word jihad, and we generally use it to mean holy war, and we generally use it to describe Muslim extremists carrying out terrorism and blowing stuff up or killing people, often in the West. That's a very particular and unique interpretation of jihad by Muslim extremists, and most Muslims would reject that definition of jihad. Instead, jihad is actually mentioned clearly in the Quran and Hadith. It means struggle. And the Quran and Hadith make it clear that there are two levels of struggle. There's the greater jihad, the really important struggle, and then there's the lesser jihad, which is important but not that important. The greater jihad is actually the struggle of each person to submit to the will of God. Now, Islam, the word Islam, it actually means submission, and a Muslim is one who submits. And what that means is that to be a good Muslim, you have to put aside your own desires for, sex or money or fame or gluttony or whatever, and instead live according to God's desires, which is morally, according to Sharia, according to the Quran and Hadith. And so the struggle is to put aside your own desires and live the way God wants you to submit to the will of God, if you will. But that's a struggle. Each individual is constantly tempted to live in ways that are contrary to God, but it's a struggle to constantly live according to God's path laid out for you. And so that's the greater jihad, is this struggle of individuals to live as good Muslims and submit to the will of God. And related to that is the idea that communities also have to do this struggle. They have to constantly resist the temptation to start organizing the community in ways that are contrary to Islam. Right? There's always going to be temptations from pornography and alcohol and gambling and whatever, and the community has to resist those temptations. That's part of the greater jihad. Then there's the lesser jihad. The lesser jihad means holy war against non-Muslims. But the Quran and Hadith are very clear that lesser jihad is not an aggressive war, in the sense that you're not waging a holy war against infidels to go conquer them in order to convert them or kill them. Rather, lesser jihad is a defensive war. If infidels attack the Muslim community, if they attack Dar al-Islam, you can defend Dar al-Islam. Right? But you are not to go out and actively destroy other communities and other religions and attack them. Now, this is an interesting dynamic because you're going to say, well, Muslims conquered this huge empire in the 600s and 700s, and that's absolutely correct. But they did not try to violently convert anybody. And in fact, the conversion of populations to Islam in the Muslim Empire was fairly slow. It's only at about the 900s that you get maybe even as late as 1,000, that about 50% of the population of, say, Egypt or Syria or Persia is actually Muslim. And part of this is because the Umayyads made very little attempt to convert people. The Umayyads basically thought of themselves as an Arab Muslim minority ruling over non-Arab, non-Muslim populations, and they really didn't care about that. And in fact, they were pretty strict about restricting the upper levels of government only to Arab Muslims, and in particular only to Umayyads. And they sort of kept everybody else out of any positions of power. But under the Abbasids, they began to open up the government and the upper reaches of society to anybody who wanted to convert to Islam, even if they weren't Arab initially, or if they were Persian or Egyptian or whatever, and they weren't Umayyads. And this led to an increase in the rate of conversions as people realized that if they wanted a career in government, converting to Islam was a big help, right? But it was never coerced, and so it took several hundred years for half the population to convert, and it took several hundred more years for most of the rest of the population to convert. But even today, in Middle Eastern societies, there are significant minorities of Christians and Jews who are still part of the community. And so even with conquest, Muslims generally didn't try to force anybody to convert. They weren't carrying out a crusade on behalf of God. They were carrying out a conquest. But once they had conquered a territory, they did impose Sharia, or laws in accordance with Islam. And so often, once a society had converted and had Sharia, it was seen as part of Dar al-Islam, even if the majority of the population hadn't converted yet. Although it was obviously the expectation was the majority of the population would convert, because Islam is obviously the truth of God and people will see it sooner or later. There's one other way that Islam extended, though, and that was through trade. That we'll see in a later lecture that the Indian Ocean saw this expansion of Muslim trade networks, that Muslim merchants spread out down Africa and around India and into Southeast Asia. And Muslims often, because of this idea of Dar al-Islam, Muslims often trusted other Muslims much more than they trusted non-Muslims, because they figured Muslims they know shared a common moral code with them, and Muslims were all engaged in the same greater jihad to sort of live morally, and so they tended to trust other Muslims. And this actually inadvertently created an incentive for merchants who weren't Muslim to convert to Islam, because it gave them access to this big Muslim trade network once they had converted to Islam. And so they had a sort of an economic incentive to convert to Islam. And this is part of the reason why today places like Indonesia are predominantly Muslim, even though they're way outside of the Middle East. And so Indonesia is part of Dar al-Islam today because of these Muslim trade networks extending beyond that. And I think I mentioned previously, but that today only about 20% of the population, of the Muslim population in the world, actually lives in the Middle East. 80% lives elsewhere, mostly in India and Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but also in parts of Africa. So that's how Islam can be extended, through trade networks, through conquest with voluntary conversion, or through just sort of what we call missionary work. But you cannot extend the House of Islam by forcing people to convert to Islam, because that does not work. Last thing I want to talk about is that there were other examples of societies that had this sort of us and them, holy, unholy, sacred, profane, inside, outside vision of the world. The Muslim world is not alone in this. The first is China. China, for a long time, had a sense of that China was the center of civilization and that everything around them was barbarians. And so there was China, which was civilization, and then there was barbarism everywhere else. And in fact, China was often referred to as the Middle Kingdom because they were the center of everything. And the Chinese acted accordingly, right? That they did not, for instance, often try to set up extensive trade networks because they figured the barbarians would come to them because they were the center of civilization. In fact, if you look at old Chinese maps, north is the bottom because the north of Asia is where the barbarians were, the Xiongnu and the nomads, the Mongols, etc. And the Chinese couldn't put them above them on a map because they're barbarians, so they had to be below them on the map, which means north is the bottom. So China has a strong sense of this sort of, this is the realm of civilization and that's the realm of barbarism. And that really shapes a lot of aspects of Chinese culture and history. The other example, is a big one, is medieval Europe. Now, we haven't gotten there in this course yet, and we'll get to there, but medieval Europeans had this idea of a city of God. That the Christian thinker Augustine had argued that every Christian has to decide if they're going to live in the city of God or in the city of the world. And he didn't mean physically living in a particular city. What he meant was that if you live your life focused on money and sex and fame and career ambitions and et cetera, all the things of this world, then you're living in the city of the world. And your rewards are you get money and fame and whatever, but then when you die, you're probably going to hell. Christians, on the other hand, Augustine said, need to live in the city of God. They need to live their life. They know that after death, they're going to get judged and they'll go to heaven if they're good Christians. So they're going to live their life focused on what God wants from them. And that means rejecting the money and rejecting the career ambition and rejecting the sex and rejecting whatever, and living morally and living focused on God and focused on getting into heaven. And if you're doing that, you're living in the city of God. And during the Middle Ages, what we're going to see is that Europeans decided that, in fact, they were going to try to build a whole society, a whole civilization that was focused on being the city of God, that the morality of the society was a Christian morality, and they were going to the society itself would be set up to enforce Christian morality so that everybody had a good chance of getting into heaven because everybody was living in the city of God down below. And this idea led to a very strong sense of Christendom, the areas where people were trying to live in the city of God, and everything else, which is the area of heathens, who were not trying to live in the city of God. And so there was a really strong sense in Christian Europe also of an us and them, that we're the city of God, we are the holy place, we are the Christian society, and everybody else is an infidel and a heathen, and they're all living immorally, and we have morality and they don't, and we're pure and they're not, and we're, et cetera, et cetera. And this also led to an idea of holy war, but the Christian idea of the crusade was way more aggressive than the Muslim idea, because the Christian crusades essentially had the goal of conquering territory, but they also had the goal of forcibly converting people after conquest, or of killing large numbers of infidels. And so Christian crusading, unlike jihad, often led to massacres. Enormous massacres, as I'll talk about in later lectures, but Christian crusaders often killed thousands or tens of thousands of innocent people, men, women, and children, in the name of Christianity. That sort of massacring does not happen throughout history in terms of jihad. But in the larger sense, then, we can say that the Muslim world has Dar al-Islam, this idea that their society is the moral one, their society is the sacred, and everything else is profane. And that shapes how Muslims view the rest of the world. But other societies like Christian Europe and even China had similar ideas about being the chosen perfect society and seeing the others as outsiders and somehow immoral or imperfect, and not being part of the sort of center of morality.